Hello, I'm Rebecca Bedford, and I'm presenting Tourism, Identity and Ownership, a demonstration of imperialism through the purchase of souvenirs. This presentation will focus on the relationship between tourists and locals of lower income countries, LICs, particularly looking at Southeast Asia. The main theme will be on how ideas of imperialism are demonstrated by the tourist through their expectations and expenditures. Previous research, such as that by Park, has shown how souvenir production can portray the authentic cultural identity and heritage of the location area, as well as the way this has been affected by the tourism industry. This is particularly apparent in the traditional unique craftsmanship versus mass overseas production. There has also been work on the attitudes of Western tourists in these locations, such as that by Cohen. Many tourists aim to see the other as a form of entertainment and fascination that comes as part of the tourism package, resulting in the locals being portrayed as actors and exhibits. My argument is that in their desire to claim global heritage as part of their own identity, Western tourists have claimed ownership over it. This is through tourists visiting these destinations already having strong ideas of what they will see and experience. In order to appeal to the tourism market, destinations have to appeal to the tourist expectations through what they have on offer aesthetically and commercially. Using Thailand as an example, I will show how the authenticity, identity and ownership of locals' own traditions are impacted by the imperialistic behaviour of tourists. The desire for authenticity is one of the main draws of tourism in both location and material goods. Many tangible and intangible heritage traditions have been commercialised for tourist consumption in the form of souvenirs, the purchase of which heavily relies on the authenticity value of them. However, these ideas of authenticity differ between the tourist's westernised prejudices and the locals' traditions. This has an impact on what locals produce in order to appeal to the westernised view of their heritage, which in itself further misleads impressions and marginalises the locals' culture. Many tourists travel to LICs in order to experience something completely different to their own everyday lives. The desire for authenticity in both location and experience is a prominent motive. However, this authenticity is judged by the tourist's Western ideas and current trends, giving them expectations of what the destination's authentic traditions are before experiencing them. This prejudgment has an impact on what the locals present for observation and purchase. The vacationer will deem their experience to be authentic if it follows their initial Westernized expectations, regardless of if it actually matches the host destination, and it is this that people are looking for at the tourist destinations. Authentic experiences are claimed to be found particularly in the countries of the global southwest, due to, as some researchers have claimed, Western tourists viewing them as more primitive and therefore more authentic. This shows that Western tourists view these communities with an imperialistic mindset, in that they believe their culture to be completely opposite to their own, and arrive with high expectations which they expect to be met. Tourists buy souvenirs as a form of proof of their travel to add to the visible part of their identity, which makes producing souvenirs one of the main ways the locals can generate income. Souvenirs are the materialization of tangible and intangible heritage made specifically for the commercialization of culture. However, even the term itself can be perceived to locals as a westernized imperialist throwaway. It marginalizes the locals' cultural product to the Western imagery of the hierarchy of material objects. People regard items termed as souvenirs as cheap objects of memory and nostalgia, showing how the term dismisses the importance of the heritage products through the commercialization of the culture by Western tourism. It could be argued, as Hume has, that the products are culturally characteristic art forms that have been enabled to be brought forth by tourism. However, they are still commoditized Western-influenced material goods, which are the product of mass tourism, rather than an authentic cultural heritage enabled by tourism. Mass tourism has had a big impact on the diversity of Thai culture and consequently in the authenticity of souvenirs sold in particular destinations. For example, Wat Ko, a small town in the southern part of Thailand, has a goldsmith heritage. However, this traditional craft community is one of the many that are in decline. The younger generations have moved to bigger cities such as Bangkok or Hua Hin to access the tourism market, taking their traditional skills with them. These traditions have started to get lost as, despite tourists desiring authenticity, they have no interest in regional cultural differences, just a souvenir that can be deemed typically Thai. Therefore, vendors produce products that can be competitive in getting the tourist commerce, rather than sticking with their own authentic heritage. Tourists' desire for their own authentic Thai souvenir has resulted in some regional traditions vanishing, showing how imperialism can be displayed through the purchase of these souvenirs. The impact on locals and how they deal with the Western commercialisation of their culture to create authenticity varies. As shown, commercialisation of the locals' culture can cause their traditional crafts to be altered to suit the trending tastes of the tourists. It is argued by Park that this could lead to a higher chance of tourists' authentic experiences being intentionally altered, which offers misleading interpretations of the destination's culture, adding further to the prejudices the tourists already had. This therefore shows how the Western imperialist thought affects not only how tourists think and behave in these locations, but also how the locations are presented to back up the tourist imagery, causing the location further marginalized from the modern West culture. Cohen uses the term emergent authenticity to refer to the growing phenomenon of the invention of tradition, which locals have to do to be competitive in the tourism market. In order to generate an income, locals have to design their products to the authenticity the tourist is expecting, sometimes having to put this over the region's actual traditional material heritage. Huser has argued that locals can also carry out self-commoditisation. This is where producers commercialise and alter their product purposely to suit that of the buyer in order to increase their sales and income. This is evident in the case of street vendors in Bangkok. As mentioned, many communities, such as goldsmiths from Wat Ko, moved to larger cities to take advantage of the mass Western tourism, and over time, their traditional cultural products have changed to suit what is popular. This links with Cohen's emergent authenticity idea, as traditional authenticity is altered to create the Western idea of authenticity. Although many locals can earn more money this way than they would have done in their home communities, their location distinctiveness gets lost, and the Western idea of Thainess is homogenized. Therefore, imperialism is displayed through Westerners purchasing the products that they believe to be authentic, whilst disregarding the different cultures within Thailand and their destination distinctiveness. Identity is a big part of the tourism industry. Tourists have strong ideas on how the journey through different destinations adds to their own sense of self. However, they also have strong opinions on what the identity of the location and its people should be as well, in order for them to gain this identity-finding experience. It is these imperialistic Western thoughts about who this other is that has an impact on the local's identity, and at the very least, how this identity can be expressed. Tourists use the vacation as a form of materialism, and the purchased local craft, the souvenirs, as solid evidence of the journey. This enhancement of their sense of self is an important aspect of many tourist holidays, and therefore they have very specific expectations on how the destination and its people will be in order to give them this experience. As previously mentioned, Western tourists go to LICs with strong expectations that their culture is completely different to their own. Therefore, in order to get custom, the locals have to complement the Western imperialistic view of their culture. They become actors in their own community to play out the tourist prejudgments, such as altering of the cultural products to the tourist taste. This is to give the impression the tourists have ventured far away from the beaten track and are having a unique experience which enhances their own identity. The attitudes of the tourists also reflect the imperialistic ideas, as they view the locals as the other. This implies that they are separate, marginalizing their culture and heritage. The display of the Western stereotypes of the other, even just for the purpose of economical gain, further cements the ideas of difference between the tourist's modern West and the local's other culture. An example of this can be seen with tourists in Thailand. Fuser states how the ideas of what is typically Thai are constantly redeveloped by the interactions between both the tourist consumers and the local producers. Typically Thai disregards any distinction between different regions and communities within the country, causing increasing levels of cultural homogenization. As already mentioned, tourists just want objects and experience by their face value, so they can be infused with their own ideas of nostalgia, rather than that of the heritage of the locals. The idea of appealing more to the Western tourist was introduced by the Thai government in the 1960s. They focused on the northern regions, particularly the hill tribe culture, in order to integrate more into the country's economy. However, international tourism organizations increasingly began focusing on this region, causing mass tourism to start. The local tourism agencies tried to promote the individual cultures and traditional crafts, mainly the Lana culture, which is where much of the popular tourist souvenirs come from. However, the identification is not very prominent among Western tourists, and instead many see this region's products as the embodiment of typically Thai. Through the purchasing of particular souvenirs and mass tourism, Western tourists show imperialism by generalizing the culture of Thailand, disregarding individuals' identity and destination distinctiveness, and replacing it with their own nostalgia. People's identity can be expressed in their tangible and intangible heritage that are distinct to their locality and demonstrated in the form of traditional crafts. However, as I have shown with the case of some districts in Thailand, the commercialization of their culture has led to the mass production of these cultural products and traditions. In order to appeal to the consumers, they have been modernized and altered, causing the intrinsic meaning and significance of the local people to get lost as it becomes business rather than tradition. It is not only their products, but also their way of life that is commercial for tourists' entertainment. The local people become the focus of the tourist gaze. They are part of the package to help the tourists to feel that they are surrounded by a different culture, in order for them to make the journey of finding themselves in the unknown. The locals' actions are controlled by the desires of the tourists, showing how the tourism industry has an imperialistic-like hold over LICs. Researchers have come up with different adjectives to describe the tourist gaze, including devouring from Yuri and prying from King. This shows how imposing the tourist can be on the locals' everyday lives. As tourism grows, almost all spaces, history, and social activities can be materially and symbolically remade. Moaz argues, however, that not all these changes are forced, by presenting the idea of the mutual gaze. This is similar to self-commoditisation, with the interaction between guest and host societies to construct and reproduce the respective cultural other. The locals change their outputs in order to get more commerce from the Western tourists. This is how the idea of Thainess is created through the interactions between locals and tourists, and how regional distinctiveness is dampened through the need to gain customers. It can therefore be argued that the concept of otherness results from the mutual gaze. However, I argue that the fact the locals need to change their products and lives to suit the Western ideas of kindness in order to gain this income is not much of a choice at all. The way the locals present themselves is influenced by the imperialistic ideas of what Western tourists believe the other is. The tourist, whether consciously or unconsciously, claims an ownership on the local's heritage. These outsiders have misleading imperialistic judgments of the communities in LICs which have to be made in order to maintain good commerce, in turn aiding the misrepresentation and marginalisation of their culture. However, through strategies such as staged authenticity, locals can claim some ownership back from the tourists. I will now show the different styles of control and how they claim ownership over people's identity and heritage for economic and social gain. Tourists take ownership of the locals' presented identity and culture through being their main source of income. As stated before, some locations and local products have been changed to suit tourist tastes. Some of these cultural commodities, made specifically for tourists, have overridden the location's traditional cultural crafts and are now seen as the authentic products of their ethnic group or region by Western tourists. This is termed as emergent authenticity and shows how the tourists have claimed ownership over some communities' cultural traditions and heritage by changing it to the vision of what, in their perspective, it should be. This can be viewed as enforcing their imperialistic ideas of LICs on their people. The collective view of tourists is channeled by large-scale tourism companies, causing the widespread impacts on culture. The tourism value of a destination is normally initiated by someone outside of the local community, which leads to the exploitation of the locals and their cultural resources by these outsiders. Because of the monopoly these companies and their patrons have on the locals' income, they have the power to control and exploit these communities to portray the exotic other as a tourist destination. Local cultural products and rituals can be altered in response to traditions or temptations from large-scale and sometimes faraway consumers. This ownership of income can lead to people migrating to more or less popular tourist places within their country. In Thailand, the hill tribe communities have been over-commercialised and have mass tourism in small locations, increasing the competition between traditional producers and overseas products. This has major effects on some tribal cultures, leading to staged adaptations of everyday life, wearing elaborate exaggerated costumes, and charging tourists to participate or witness. With the monopoly tourism has on some destinations' income, some communities, such as Aka tribes from the Chiang Mai region, have had to migrate south as competition, taking their traditional heritage skills with them. These can then get altered to suit the tourists in different destinations, either by over-exaggerating the culture or losing it altogether. This therefore gives tourists an imperialistic-like ownership of some lower-income communities' cultural heritage and identity. For locals, tourism is invasive, as Western strangers are encouraged by companies to explore and interact with these communities. The host's day-to-day setting becomes a tourist attraction for the guest, as they become part of the intrigue for tourists to get to know the other. This is another way that shows how the locals are exploited by the tourism companies in that they are made into actors and their local community a stage. However, there are ways in which the locals can take back the ownership of what they offer tourists. Moaz, Larson and Uri came up with 3 strategies that are most commonly used by locals in touristification. The first is cooperation. This is a strategy that most links to the idea that the Western tourists have ownership over the locals' cultural heritage. Local customs and businesses are altered in reaction to travellers' needs and wants. Moaz even states that this is due to the locals viewing themselves as the weaker part of the guest-host relationship, which backs up the idea of the tourism industries exploiting these communities for their own gain. The next strategy is veiled resistance, which can also be referred to as staged authenticity. Products are staged to look authentic and are embraced by authenticity-eager tourists, when in fact the locals are mocking their inability to see through the fake. This takes away some of the control the Western tourists have, but the locals are still able to get their custom. The final strategy is open resistance. This reaction is where locals maintain their traditional cultural identity and traditions and can even treat travellers with open disdain, which is complete resistance against imperialistic tourist companies. It allows the people to maintain and have ownership over their own heritage and identity. However, they could lose the valuable income tourists bring. An example in Thailand, where some of these strategies are in place, is within the popular hill tribe region. The veiled or open resistance strategies are demonstrated by locals using their distinct traditional patterns or techniques in their product, but often using modern lines. What makes this authentic to them is that these projects are primarily to sell to other locals, so they have not been purposely changed to suit Western tourists. For example, hand-woven bags from the Lana culture are made using traditional methods and patterns, using the traditional black and white colours. As tourists prefer other colours, these are made as well, allowing producers to access this income stream. Therefore, they are still able to create the traditional authentic craft for their own use, as well as an altered version for the paying consumer. However, with the success of the hill tribe tourism, some Western tourists now consider their culture to be the embodiment of what is typically Thai. This shows that even resisting influence from Western tourists and organisations could have implications on the locals of a LIC, even when some regions are fighting to keep ownership over their own heritage and traditions. Tourists demonstrate imperialism through the purchase of souvenirs. As this is the main source of income for locals, tourist destinations in LICs, these sales are important to them. Imperialism is demonstrated through ideas of authenticity, as souvenirs, the locals' cultural products, need to be altered to suit the taste of tourists. The Western bias causes emergent authenticity and locals to produce products posing as their authentic crafts. Imperialism is demonstrated through ideas of identity. The locals, and in some cases, day-to-day lives of locals, are altered to highlight the otherness of the destination. Their lives become the object of the tourist gaze. Imperialism is demonstrated through ideas of ownership. Local traditions and heritage is taken away from the locals and controlled by tourism companies. The locals are exploited through economic imbalances. There are ways in which locals can use techniques to exploit the greed and incompetence of Western tourists. For ideas of self-commoditisation, the mutual gaze, and open resistance, locals can take back ownership of their own identity and heritage. Overall, for the majority of locals of tourist destinations in LICs, they are exploited by Western companies to demonstrate the idea of the other through their products and, in some cases, way of life. The locals are often not in a position to fight it, as their income comes from the custom of tourists. This shows how tourists can demonstrate imperialism through the purchase of souvenirs. Thank you for listening to my presentation on tourism, identity and ownership, the demonstration of imperialism through the purchase of souvenirs.